Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the third Sunday in Lent, which this year falls on March 12th. We have one content notification for this episode. We talk about child endangerment when discussing the deep dive.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode. So, Emily, what is our deep dive about today?
Wells, actually.
And don't worry, folks, we're not talking about the Lutheran denomination, the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod.
Yeah, no, they're too scary. Wells, however, are also sometimes scary.
I mean, sure. Fair.
I mean, sometimes not. We've got plenty of examples of them being scary.
Yes.
We are talking about wells, as in the stuff that helps us drink water and have good water and all of those things.
Yes.
We are not talking about wells, as in any corrupt banking institutions. We are not talking about wells, as in any way of acquiring crude oil. We are really focusing on water. The water wells.
Yes. Water is good for you, and you should go drink some.
Truth. This is a great reminder to drink some water. And we're not diving too deep into the water, but if you want, you can check out our episode on water from, I think, our first
season. Yep.
First
it was
season,
actually pretty early in the
Baptism
first
of
season.
Jesus.
Yeah,
it was Baptism of Jesus. We did a deep dive into water. It was great. But we'll link to that in the episode notes. Anyway, wells are basically holes in the ground filled with water. That's like the most simple definition of them. They are really vital to sustainable communities. So a lot of development in parts of the world that have been exploited and whose resources have been stolen, a lot of the development is in building wells for communities and helping people in communities learn how to build their own wells, but also building them so that communities have water that they can use. Historically, wells have been dug into the ground by hand deep enough to go below the water table, which is the underground height of water in the area. And then they get walled up with stone to keep the sand and dirt back. And frequently there are pumps for them. Some places it's a hand pump, some places it's an electric pump. If it's an electric pump, make sure you know what to do if your electricity goes out.
Yeah. And these days you don't usually find the kinds of wells that have a bucket with them that you drag the water up with. That's not how modern wells work, really.
It's true. Although when I was in Slovakia, the two public wells, which were in intentionally impoverished areas of town, were the hand pump wells. And they were shared 2 wells among 700 people.
Wow.
Which is not a great idea. We'll get into that more later.
Yeah. So when it comes to wells, there are several different kinds. There are 3 basic ways to make wells. You can either dig a well or make a driven well, but those wells are going to be shallow. Or you can drill a well, which is going to be deep and also very expensive these days. So, for example, a bored shallow well would be 100 feet or less deep. That's into an unconfined water source. Or you can have a consolidated or rock well, which is a well that's been drilled into a rock formation that doesn't have soil, just solid rock, and so the well doesn't collapse in on itself. Those can go up to 250 feet deep. And also you can have what's called an unconsolidated or sand well, which is a well that's drilled into a formation of soil, sand, gravel, clay, that kind of thing. And it will frequently collapse in on itself unless it has support.
Yeah. And there's a great YouTube video that kind of goes into detail on different wells and how they work, as well as an article and we'll link to both of them. And then when we talk about the construction of wells, especially when we think about it today, though there are a variety of ways that this also was part of the construction in earlier times, there's 4 main parts of the construction of a well. One is the casing. So the casing is basically this tube, and it is there to maintain access to the water and prevent leakage. People use anything from steel to PVC pipe and concrete pipes for that. And then grout is usually used as a sealant to fill in the spaces on the outside of the well, so that prevents contaminants from seeping in to the well. And then most wells have a screen, and the screen is there to keep sand and gravel out of the well while simultaneously allowing groundwater and water formations to get into the well or to remain in the well. They are used particularly in unconsolidated or sand wells, the last type of well that Kay talked about, because there's sand and dirt and those sorts of things. Or soil, as farmers have taught me it is called when it is in the ground.
Yes, when soil is where it's supposed to be, it's soil. When soil is not where it's supposed to be, it's dirt.
Yep. And then the final kind of piece of well construction is the gravel pack, and that surrounds the outside of the screen to keep it clear from sand and clogging so that the water can get through and the sand doesn't just basically form its own wall. It also can stabilize the well's assembly itself. So that's like the very basics, but depending on which type of well you're constructing, if you're trying to go for historical reenactments or the most modern fancy, there's a lot of diversity in what you can do and how you do it. And in terms of, as we said, pumps, whether it's a manual pump, these days I think most of them are electric pumps, but might have a manual option, or depending on where they're from, might be manual, because electricity might not be as readily accessible, that sort of thing.
Sure. So what about well water? How is well water different than living on, say, city water? Well, both Emily and I have lived on well water at various times in our lives. And one of the things that you can almost certainly count on with well water is that it will have a certain amount of natural minerals present. And the balance is going to be a little different everywhere, but you will probably get more of certain vitamins and minerals than you would otherwise expect. And personally speaking, when I've lived on well water, the places that I've lived, that well water has always had an especially strong presence of iron. In one case, it was so strong that using the washing machine left stains on my clothes, and there was so much rust in the bathtub, like it wasn't a metal bathtub, it was just the rust from the water, the residue, that it genuinely kind of looked like blood residue. And the only thing I ever found that actually cleaned that up, and I tried a whole bunch of different cleaning products, was the cleaning product called The Works. So if you have trouble with rust in your bathtub and you can't figure out how to clean it, try The Works. It did a lovely job, but it was literally the one thing available in the store that would do any kind of difference at all. So that was amazing. Yeah. As you might imagine, though, the well water can, under the wrong circumstances, get contaminated, and that is bad. You don't want your well water to be contaminated, and also it might not be getting quite as thoroughly cleaned depending on how your well works. You might have a filter on it, but it's not going through the sanitation process that city water does. So you do want to keep an eye on that and test your well water fairly regularly.
We had, when I worked at camp, we had water from a water system in the camp, and so well water, and we had to test it regularly and make sure there was the right amount of all of the things in it, especially because it was a camp, and so it had more regulations than like,
I'm sure they had rules. Yeah.
Well, also, the question I had when it came to potable water and like contaminated water was, what happens with all the coins that are thrown in like wells as wishing wells, for example? And the reality is that that practice actually is a practice found in most places around the world, and was a common practice to like appease or be kind to the spirits that were thought to live in the wells. And then it became more personalized, and people would like have a personal wish that went with the coin. And nowadays, if there are fountains or those sorts of things where people toss in coins, they get cleaned out. And so it's not a concern for contamination, although there's a cool article that we'll link to about someone who's making a wishing coin that is made of algae, so that if you're throwing it into somewhere with marine life, instead of marine animals trying to eat coins, they'll eat the algae that is actually their food. And I thought that was like just this delightful thing.
Yeah. And then you can go feed the fish.
Exactly.
Just like Moana.
Yes.
Just remember, don't feed them tuna. That would be cannibalism.
Wow.
I really liked that part of the movie. It was fun.
It's fair.
It was perfectly good 6-year-old logic. I was very
Uh-huh.
impressed.
Uh-huh. And one of my roommates, Brooke, was talking about having grown up on well water and that they used salt to keep their well water clean and drinkable and stuff. So
Sure.
that I thought was really cool and not something that we learned in our salt deep dive. So, an additional fact, if you want more facts about salt, you can check out our salt deep dive from a couple weeks
True.
ago, which we will link.
Yeah, I'm definitely used to using salt in a water softener, but not so much to filter water. So, interesting.
Yeah, it made sense to me because I've heard of it as a thing like in private pools. You can use
Sure.
chlorine to like do whatever to the pools, but you can also do a salt filter. So
Yeah.
it's like, okay. Anyway, when I was in Slovakia, the Roma area of town was just technically outside of the town borders, and it was intentionally impoverished because of discrimination against Roma people and lack of access to resources and those sorts of things. So they had 2 pumps for all like 700 people.
Yeah.
And people would use the pumps for everything from bathing to washing cars to drinking, all of that stuff. And so there was a point at which the water actually got contaminated and people started getting hepatitis A from it because it was that contaminated. And so then we had to like change up how we were doing things for our like after school program and stuff. And fun fact, the word for jaundice in Slovak is the same word for hep A. So I kept being told that everybody was getting jaundice, and I was like, I had that as a baby. What? They meant hep
Okay.
A. But yeah, so having wells and access to water is really important, and having ways to keep them not contaminated is also very important.
Yeah. And speaking of things that can contaminate your water, if you're on well water, you do want to be especially careful not only with your own use, but also especially keeping an eye on your neighbor's use of pesticides.
Mm-hmm.
Any nearby pesticides can theoretically leak into your water. It's more likely if the pesticides are used at a higher elevation than the elevation of your well. It can absolutely come downhill with rain and leak into your well, and that can do some pretty nasty stuff to your well water and eventually to you. So please keep an eye
Yes.
out for that.
Indeed, and that counts not only for pesticides, but also for people that get buried on top of hills. We pump a lot of chemicals into people these days when we bury them. But yeah, in southeastern Minnesota, when I was there, like the water in town was in like a water tower or whatever, right? But that water, like you could trace because of the runoff from farming and like big ag and stuff, like you could tell which houses were closest because it would just like go down the street and be like, that person has cancer, that person has cancer, that person has cancer, that person has cancer. So the
Yeah.
pesticides are really dangerous, and there's a lot of work being done on more state and local levels, but it's really hard to fight against
Yeah.
the use of pesticides and the ways that they harm not just their geographic area, but the whole watershed. So, all the way down, thinking about what happened in East Palestine, right? In Palestine, I don't know, they pronounce it weird. In Ohio,
Okay.
where that water gets contaminated, it goes all the way down to the Mississippi. So, that
Yeah.
contamination carries through that whole way as well.
Yeah.
So, don't contaminate water, people.
Right.
Keep our wells safe.
So, historically speaking, when it comes to wells, two incidents jumped out at me immediately. One of these I sort of hesitate to call historical because it happened during my lifetime and I object. But the other one that is obviously historical, some of you may be aware of the story of the 1854 cholera outbreak in London. And it was a very nasty outbreak. It killed a lot of people. It was based primarily in a very poor neighborhood. And a doctor named Dr. John Snow was looking into what was causing the outbreak because eventually they sort of got the area closed down a bit and managed to keep the infection from spreading. But new people kept getting infected with cholera, and he could not figure out how they were contacting each other or spreading the disease. And also, there was this one guy who lived in a completely different neighborhood who caught cholera, and Dr. Snow really didn't know why he caught it. And he sent someone to investigate to the gentleman's house who lived in a different neighborhood. And that person found out that the man who lived there had grown up in the same poor neighborhood where the cholera outbreak was, and he really liked the taste of the water from the well there. And so he sent a servant to that well every couple of days to get a couple of buckets of water for him to drink from that well. And for everything else, he used the water at his home in this completely different neighborhood, but he drank the well water from this one neighborhood. And so this led to Dr. John Snow famously going to the Broad Street pump and taking the handle off it, because the handle was infected with cholera, and that's how the cholera was spreading for weeks. And so the Broad Street pump handle was a famous case of studying how infection worked. And I read about it personally in a children's book about the history of medicine like a million years ago that I don't remember the title of, but it
That sounds
showed
like
up.
a fascinating book, and I am jealous. And if you
There
ever
were a
remember
few
the
of them,
title, I
I
want to know.
guess. But if you went to a museum that like focused on the history of medicine, they always had a couple of very weird books on the history of medicine that were aimed at kids. And so it was probably something like that. But once they took off the handle from the Broad Street pump, lo and behold, nobody else got cholera. And then, eventually they put a new one on that was nice and clean. But yeah.
That's helpful. I was going to say, also, nobody had access to water.
Well, yeah, that was not great, but also they could bring water in, so it worked out. The other historical incident, which I object to calling historical because I was, I think, 3 when this happened.
I was
4.
like 1.
I was 4. Yeah, okay. Is the story of Jessica McClure, who, by the way, is, as I discovered while doing research for this podcast, that is not who is usually referred to as Baby Jessica. I think I grew up thinking of her as Baby Jessica, but that's actually a custody case that happened, I guess, somewhat earlier than this. And so Baby Jessica and Jessica McClure are 2 separate Jessicas.
Noted.
But this Jessica was about 18 months old when she fell into an 8-inch diameter well casing in her aunt's backyard on October 14th, 1987. And she was trapped inside the well casing for 58 and a half hours before she was rescued. With, if I remember right, one of her legs was stuck over her head. They explained how she was situated inside the well casing, and it sounded super uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I mean, she was 18 months old. I can only imagine how panicked she was, but also there was an adorable note to the story that while the rescuers were working on digging down to get to her and then digging over to get to the well, they could occasionally hear her singing the Winnie the Pooh song to herself, which I thought was very sweet.
Winnie the Pooh, Winnie the Pooh.
Also, every 18-month-old kid I know would, sing that for hours, just those 3 words over and over and over again. And so presumably, yeah. And they did rescue her. She was born in 86, so she's, I guess, in her late 30s. And today she's doing just fine. They had to amputate one toe after the rescue because of gangrene. And she has a scar on her forehead, I guess. But otherwise, she's okay. She's apparently happily married and has a couple kids and is doing just fine. Also, there was a TV movie made in 1989 starring Patty Duke and Beau Bridges, and they found several people who either participated in the rescue or were neighbors of the family, and they used those folks as extras in the movie. And I believe, I am not entirely certain, but I believe I have seen a chunk of this movie, and wow, is it bad. Kind of like that laughably bad TV movie kind of thing. They tried. It's a very sincere effort. I do want to praise them for that. And apparently it's reasonably accurate. But also,
Hallmark style.
Yeah, TV movie about rescuing a baby in a well. This is exactly what that was. Yep. And speaking of rescuing babies in wells, I suppose for many of us, the first thing that came to mind was, of course, Lassie. I grew up watching bits and pieces of Lassie on Nick at Night, and Lassie and his best friend, the young boy Timmy, of course, are famous for Lassie telling Timmy that someone is stuck in a well, and then Timmy goes and investigates and gets help. And collies probably can't actually talk to you, in real life.
What?
Generally. Also, They're not very good at charades, so telling you that someone has been stuck in a well is going to be really difficult for them. And if you
Sounds
want
fake.
one as a pet, they are reportedly very good with kids, but also they need a certain amount of exercise, or else they are going to start hurting your entire family with great enthusiasm. So keep that in mind if you want to adopt a collie.
I have definitely been around dogs that are hurting dogs, and it's hilarious when they're like,
Yes.
come
Like, they
on,
can be
come on.
excellent with toddlers, but also, like, they will absolutely tell your toddler when it's time to go.
Yeah.
So,
We had somebody visiting a little while ago, and they brought their dog, and their dog
mhm,
is a pit bull. And at one
sure.
point, there were like a couple people on the porch and a couple people inside, and the dog didn't know what to do because they were split up. We were all split up,
Yes.
and they were like, how do
Yes.
I herd you? How do I herd you? How do I get you together? It was hilarious and
Mhm.
adorable. And for those of you who maybe didn't think of Lassie for your first thought, you might be with me who thought of Batman.
Yay, Batman.
So, part of Batman's origin story is that while the young Bruce Wayne was playing at Wayne Manor as a kid, he fell down a dry well. So, a well that no longer holds water, probably because the water table has decreased or the aquifer that it was in has dried up or something like that. And so, falls down the well and then is kind of attacked by a swarm of bats, slash, there's a swarm of bats, and he gets all freaked out and develops this like legit phobia of bats.
Yeah.
Eventually, he gets rescued by his dad. And the key part of the story is that later, like, at least in one version, there are probably a million, but in one version, the well is then connected to the bat cave that becomes like the place that he stores the Batmobile and does all his Batmaning, and he becomes Batman.
I love
I
Batman
think
as
it's
a
weird.
verb. That's excellent. Yeah.
I like a good Batmaning.
Also, now I want the alternate universe version of this where he's rescued by his mom instead. I'm just
Mm.
saying.
That I think would be interesting because I think it would give a different sense and a different feel
Yeah.
for sure.
I've also recently been playing through the video game Kingdom Come Deliverance, and there is actually a quest in that game to find the cause of a disease in a town, and it turns out that it's due to a contaminated well. And I don't
Hmm.
know that anyone particularly thought that this would be a good idea, but please don't throw dead bodies into wells. Like, that's just a bad plan. No.
Yeah, don't do that. No dead
Yeah.
bodies, no dirty diapers, none of that.
No dead animals. Yeah.
Also, in the TV show Once Upon a Time, there is a wishing well, and I don't remember all of the like different ways it's used, but there's definitely parts where it is used as like a wishing well full of all the magic possibilities, and spells are cast in
Sure.
it and from it and all sorts of things. I don't know that anybody actually ever drinks out of it though, which is probably a good thing based on the other uses it is put to.
Drinking magic water could have unexpected side effects. I could see
It
that
does.
going very weird.
Just ask Merry and Pippin.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, in the TV show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the character Grant Ward has a well in his backstory as well. Okay, that was not intentional. But now that I think about it, I do kind of wonder if they were sort of trying to make a connection to Batman for that, because,
Mm,
like, he did not have a Batcave in the TV show. Sorry if I'm spoiling anyone, but there was no Batcave,
that's
which
fair. I
actually
probably
turns
won't
out to
watch
be a
it.
good thing. But it's unclear whether it was him or his older brother who was threatening the other one with that well, or possibly both ways. It remains unclear. But
Mm.
that well and his brothers had a formative effect in his childhood. So,
All right. And also, of course, because we are nerds at church, we got to
yay!
talk about the Bible. Well,
Please don't be surprised.
yeah. So in the Bible, there are lots of wells, and they all have their own different names and all sorts of things. This makes sense because the place that they were living, and still today, is very arid and deserty. And so they needed water, especially if they were traveling. They needed to be
Yeah,
able to access water. So that was part of the communal care for people who were traveling and for communities, was to build wells. And if something important happened there, then you named the well something important. And still to today, water access is vital. And that's actually one of the things that is one of the largest struggles for Palestinians, is not having access to water that they should have access to.
yeah.
But one of my favorite well stories is the story of Hagar. When she gets pregnant, Sarai treats her terribly. Hagar is a slave, and Sarai treats Hagar terribly and she runs away and finds like this spring of water in the wilderness to drink from. And an angel of God comes to her and is like, "What are you doing?" That sort of thing. And then the angel ends up telling her to go back to Sarai. This is a complicated story. Please do not take it at face value. Don't go back to abusive relationships. That's not what like the larger story is. Just trying to get
Amen.
to the well part. But Hagar ends up being the first person to name God in the Bible. So she calls God Elroy and says, "Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing God?" And so then the well becomes Bir Lahai Roy. And so there's those connections. And I love that because it's someone who in the rest of the story is very much dispossessed, oppressed, and harmed. And yet there is this well that bears witness to her naming of God.
Yeah. And biblically speaking, there are a lot of wells, as Emily said, and one of the things that tended to happen at wells, because they were so central to not just survival, but also community, was that people tended to meet there. And people being, human people, they also tended to flirt there. And so there are several stories in the Bible of people meeting their future spouse at the well.
It was like the biblical Tinder, I think.
Maybe
Bumble?
I would more go with like the biblical club. Like this is
Okay.
this is where you went to meet people. Yeah. I suppose they probably had taverns, even if we don't tend to focus on them in the Bible. But also you met a lot of people there. And in the Bible you see that Isaac and Rebekah meet at a well, and Jacob and Rachel meet at a well, and of course much, much later, eventually Jesus and the Samaritan woman met at a well, even if they didn't wind up having a romance novel for themselves, as it were.
That we know of.
Yeah. Let's say, I'm sure somebody has written that story, but I don't think it's been professionally published, whereas I'm pretty sure that someone has actually written, like, novels for the other ones.
That's fair.
I'm not saying they're good novels.
Well, actually, I bet there's plenty of midrash around this.
Oh, yes. No, the Midrash is probably excellent. But,
Some
like,
of
the
it has
novels,
to have
Orson
published.
Scott Card wrote a couple of novels about there's one about Sarah and Abraham, and then he did the next couple generations. And I read the first one, and it wasn't terrible, but they don't meet at a well, of course, Abram and Sarai. So,
Not everybody can.
yeah.
Yeah.
Our first reading is from Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. When the Israelites are desperate for water to drink, Moses seeks help from God. God tells Moses to strike a rock with the same staff he used to change the Nile to blood so Pharaoh would let them go. Water springs out, and God has saved God's people again.
It's a good thing it's not blood that springs out.
Yeah, don't mix water and blood either while we're at it.
Emphasis on the...
Especially if you're going to drink whatever it is. Yeah.
So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of thirst, right? Of needing to drink water to quench thirst. And water is a good thirst quencher, as is like Gatorade and stuff. Just don't drink the cactus juice, even if Sokka swears it's the quenchiest. You might have hallucinations and that'd be dangerous.
Avatar The Last Airbender does occasionally have a useful piece of life advice. And, not drinking cactus juice. Yep, fair. Okay.
Also, shout out to Matt Bird, because I will always think of Matt Bird for that one.
Okay.
He's one of our listeners. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 1 we read, "From the wilderness of Sin, the whole congregation of the Israelites journeyed by stages, as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink."
So this is not a nerdy thing, but regarding Sin as a place name, when I read this, I was reminded that I was once in a congregation with a large family who had the last name of Sin with 2 N's. And I was very careful while I was there to not bring it up with them, although actually one person did bring it up with me of the family. But I did not bring it up with them because I'm sure they've heard every possible version of every possible joke. But I did at one point, while still fairly early on there, have a moment looking through the directory with the secretary where I said, "Wow, this congregation sure has a lot of..." Wait. And she thought it was pretty funny, thankfully.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. I think it is a fairly common Scandinavian name from one of the Scandinavian places, but I don't remember which. Possibly Norwegian.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Also, you could just be math nerds. Sine, cosine,
Sure. Sure.
tangent, all sorts of possibilities for names.
Yes.
I was looking at the passage and I was thinking about the water, and the Israelites recognize water is definitely really important in surviving the wilderness. Hashtag thanks Hunger Games / Katniss. But as
Sure.
Andrew pointed out in our Lent 1 episode, shelter is in fact the most important. And so at least they had shelter, I'm assuming, even if they were still trying to figure out water.
Sure. I think so.
Mm-hmm.
And then in verse 2 we read, "The people quarreled with Moses and said, 'Give us water to drink.' Moses said to them, 'Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?' 'Yes, Moses, this is what happens when you refuse to stop and ask for directions. Just ask Fozzie Bear in the Muppet Movie when his route from Florida to California includes both Rhode Island and Saskatchewan.'" I'm just saying, sometimes directions are good.
That's fantastic.
Also, in verse 5, we read, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Go on ahead of the people, and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go.'" And I am guessing that when this says that Moses took the elders with him, it means like some of the leaders of the Israelites to witness God doing this thing, rather than specifically deciding to take some of the most elderly people among them with him to see him do this thing. Like, that seems like a bad choice overall, and also possibly like some weird takeoff on the movie Cocoon. So probably leaders rather than the elderly.
Or a young adult dystopia that I've read a long time ago.
Sure.
I don't remember which one, but like
Sure.
all the elders go at a certain time and place.
Logan's Run?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
No,
That's the one where everyone dies when they're 30.
Oh, no, it's everyone dies when they're older than that, but it's everyone dies on like their birthday.
Well, The Giver did that.
Birthday.
Sure.
Maybe it's The Giver.
Well, when they're elderly, I guess it's not specified whether it's a particular birthday, but like once they are past usefulness, sort of.
Yeah. So this is not The Giver story. Yeah. And then in verse 6, we read God is talking to Moses and says, "I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock and water will come out of it so that the people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And this definitely feels like a Maui kind of moment to me in Moana when she like finds him on this like island that he's stranded on with like just a bunch of boulders, and he like jumps up on the rock during his song to be all like big and brave and cool, and he's like, "Maui." I could sing the whole thing, but I won't. There's already a recording of me doing that somewhere.
I'm sure, yes.
Yeah. Our second reading for this episode is Romans chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. Jesus Christ was willing to die for us when we were still sinners. And so Paul tells us we can trust in God through any suffering, even to the point of boasting. Well, one of the themes for this passage is the idea that God helps those who can't help themselves.
Amen.
Yeah, that it is in fact true that God is not about bootstraps and picking yourself up by your own bootstraps, which is a like impossibility according to the laws of physics, or capitalism, as Dr. Felipe Maya pointed out in our episode last fall, which we'll link to. God is about helping those who can't help themselves, doing things and showing up when there's no repayment. Yay, God.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 3 we read, "And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance." And this definitely feels like the motto for Blackcliff, the school where they train the elite and deadliest soldiers of the Empire, basically through years of torture. Yes, I did just finish rereading the first book in the Ember in the Ashes series, in case you're wondering.
Yep. And then in verse 4 we read, "And endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And raise your hand if you have ever read this verse at a Bible study and followed it with some version of, and something something leads to the dark side." Because I definitely have. Not just once, but possibly several times. Although usually I go with some version of, and hope does not lead to the dark side, just to be clear. Although I do also occasionally include something about the dark side having cookies. So, balance and everything.
It's true.
Sure.
The dark side definitely has cookies.
Yes.
Delightful, delightful cookies. Mm-hmm.
And then in verse 7, we read, "Indeed, rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person someone might actually dare to die." So we've talked about righteousness on this podcast before. In fact, we actually did a whole deep dive on it.
Yeah, we did. But we'll link to it in the episode description.
Yes. And righteousness is about keeping in right relationship with others. You're basically fulfilling your relationship obligations, or also very possibly just doing the bare minimum. Being righteous is not an especially difficult mark to hit. Like, this is mostly possible for most people. And a good person would go way above that. And so this reminds me of the misunderstanding between Yondu and Peter Quill in Guardians of the Galaxy. Yondu saw himself as a sort of father figure to Peter, who kindly took in an orphan and who joked around with him during Peter's childhood. Only what he didn't know was that Peter didn't get the joke when Yondu talked about, "I haven't eaten you today, you're welcome," on a daily basis, and was, horrified by Yondu. And so Yondu thought that he was good, and Peter, who was, fed and sheltered by Yondu, but also convinced he was about to die pretty much every day, barely thought Yondu was righteous, if that. So, that's kind of where the line is. Also, I definitely have family members that would have joked around with me about, "Well, I haven't eaten you today. Congratulations. Consider yourself lucky." That is absolutely the kind of humor my family would go for. So I really can't blame Yondu for that.
Yeah, I was thinking, that actually seems like not the most obscure of jokes, but I can see how in the wrong context it is terrifying.
Yeah, you need to know each other very well before you can start making that kind of joke.
Yeah. Especially if you, kind of kidnapped the person.
Complicated.
Yep. Then in verse 10 we read, "For if while we were enemies we were reconciled to God through the death of God's Son, much more surely, having been reconciled, will we be saved by the Son's life." And this reminded me of the trials in Ember and the Ashes. There are the first book, it's a bunch of trials to become emperor. There are 4 trials, and each time it basically changes who the enemy is, and so the enemies are designated and changed really quickly, almost as quickly as Jesus' about face of death and resurrection for us. It's a little bit of a stretch, but I think it works.
I think it works, sure, absolutely. And then our gospel reading for this episode is from John chapter 4, verses 5 through 42. Yes, I did say that correctly. It's a long reading.
Welcome to Lent.
Yeah. In a flirtatious conversation with a Samaritan woman at a well, Jesus expands on the wideness of God's love and mercy, which leads her to share the truth of Jesus' ministry with others.
So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of courtship. As we already mentioned, wells are a great place to meet your future somebody. And so...
in the Bible.
In the Bible.
No guarantees for real life. For
yeah,
today.
But biblically, pretty guaranteed biblically. Real life, meh. So like Jacob at the well, which is called to mind in this passage, both Jacob and the well. Some people meet at wells. Some people create nebulas on the ceiling. Some people buy stationary supplies. And some offer living water. So many different ways.
I think Jesus is the only one who offers living water.
Details. Offhand. I bet there are marine biologists who also might offer living water.
That's a different kind of living water, yes.
But still.
Water with life in it. Also, not necessarily water you would want to drink in that case. But
yeah. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 15, the woman says to Jesus, "Sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." So she is taking Jesus' words literally, much like Nicodemus did last week, which makes this and last week's readings a great examples of why scriptural and conversational literalism is not actually all that helpful.
Yeah, sometimes Jesus is very clearly not doing that.
Can't take everything literally unless you're taking everything literally. And if you're taking everything literally, where is this living water? And how is it breathing?
Well, that's creepy.
Anyway, and then in verse 29, the woman goes to the people of her town and says, "Come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he?" To which I say, preach! This is the first documented evangelism for Jesus in the Bible. Or perhaps it's a revival? Hashtag, I don't know what is going on at Asbury. Somebody help me, because I don't know.
I am unclear on where Asbury is,
Same.
actually. Although the one thing I know is going on at Asbury, sadly, is homophobia, because I definitely saw a tweet the other day where they were celebrating some girl saying that she had been cured of witchcraft and lesbianism, which is an interesting combination, but okay.
A
Yeah,
non-surprising combination for me. But
yeah.
yeah.
Also, I hate to say this, but I don't think that this particular gospel story can be a revival, because a revival is to bring something like back to life, and so this could just be a vival
Ooh, I
instead.
like it. Like Vival Goes West.
Oh no. That was such a terrible movie. The first one was great. The second one was really kind of not.
I feel
Some
like
of the
I have
songs were good.
positive memories of them, but I haven't seen them in
Yes,
forever.
no, I definitely have positive memories of them, but that's because I watched them when I was 5. When I rewatched them later, I was not impressed.
Yeah, Pace watched them and was like, nope. And I was like, oh, sad days. I would like to rewatch them. Anyway,
Yes.
perhaps it is not a revival, but as friend of the podcast, River Needham, said at one point, if it's a revival, it means an upending of the structures that cause harm. And that
Well,
doesn't
that's
seem to
good.
be what is happening.
No.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I read that same verse, and I thought to myself, well, we know that she has outlived 5 husbands. And I think that usually takes a while, unless, like, she was, helping herself to outlive them in active ways that wouldn't be good. Murder bad.
Murder
But
bad.
if she is being told literally everything she's ever done, speaking of taking the Bible literally and why it's a bad idea, how long were they at that well? Like, that would be an incredible cutscene montage slash, flashback of your entire life in a moment before your eyes kind of thing. And that would have taken quite a while. And also, creepy.
Yeah.
I don't think I would react in a happy and loving manner to that. So I'm assuming that she is exaggerating just a teeny bit.
Yeah.
But
Although, to be fair, they were at it long enough for the disciples to like go find
come
food
back
or
and find them.
whatever and
Yes,
come back. So,
sure.
yeah.
And by at it, we mean conversing. Presumably.
Maybe.
I mean, it is a well. It's a very public place. So.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. And then in verse 31, we read, "Meanwhile, the disciples were urging Jesus, 'Rabbi, eat something.' And I would like to remind our listeners that while we know that Jesus will eventually be heading toward his death, the disciples aren't actually clear on that yet, and so this is not like when James Bond's enemies used to feed him a meal to lull him into complacency. Rather, this is much more along the lines of my grandmother making sure that I had had third helpings before letting me leave the table." So,
Yes, definitely.
yes.
Yep. And now for our welliest segment, our deepest segment. Let's make a Muppets musical. Okay, who are you casting this week?
Well, I was thinking about our first reading, and if in a sort of like the Clue board game kind of sense, if Moses hit the rock with the staff and out came water, then I'm asking myself, what Muppet would hit the rock with what, and then what would come out? And so my first example of that is the Swedish chef hitting the rock with a ladle and getting soup, I think. Like, that makes sense to me.
I like
And
it.
I'm sure
I like it.
Cookie Monster would manage to get cookies somehow, although I don't know what he would hit the rock with to get cookies.
Spatula.
Possibly. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So yeah, I think there's a bunch of different options for that.
Yeah. When you started saying that, I was like, Cookie Monster, spatula, Cookie
Yes.
Monster, cookies, spatula. Spatula is what
Yes.
he would use. Yeah.
Excellent.
I was looking at the gospel reading and thinking that Miss Piggy and Kermit flirting would be like a great depiction of this scene. Though I have to say, Miss Piggy would probably be at least as much Jesus as the woman, if not more, because she is definitely the big flirt. And Kermit is less of a flirt, but
Sure.
still kind of a flirt. And Jesus is definitely flirting with this woman.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 4th Sunday of Lent. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than buying a bunch of bottled water, digging your own well, any of those options. Paying
Yes.
for city water.
Yeah. Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christian said, Pax
Pax vobiscum.
vobiscum.